The impact shattered 3 levels of corroded plasteel before Itachi's body stopped moving. Dust and toxic fumes filled his lungs as consciousness returned in fragments, pain, darkness, the metallic taste of blood that wasn't his own. His Sharingan activated on instinct, twin crimson wheels spinning in the blackness, and the world resolved into patterns of threat and geometry. He was deep. The air pressure told him that much. Perhaps a kilometer beneath whatever surface this world possessed. The atmosphere carried industrial pollutants. He'd never encountered compounds that would kill an ordinary human in minutes. His chakra network compensated, automatically filtering toxins, but the effort required was notable. Wherever he had fallen, it was not his world. The Sharingan cataloged his surroundings in 3 heartbeats. A manufactory floor long abandoned. Rust consumed everything metal. Promethium stains marked the floor in patterns that suggested decades of leakage. The ceiling stretched 15 meters overhead, reinforced with girders that showed stress fractures in 17 locations. Sound carried strangely here, the acoustics of a space designed for machinery that no longer existed. Then he heard the voices. Itachi moved to the shadows without conscious thought, his body becoming part of the darkness that pooled between collapsed assembly lines. The voices grew louder, accompanied by footsteps that echoed against metal and stone. 2 groups approaching from different vectors. Neither group knew the other was present. The first group emerged from a corridor to his left. Civilians, 12 of them, their clothing tattered and stained with industrial grime. Malnutrition showed in their movements. Children among them, 3 their eyes too large for their faces. They moved with the desperate quiet of prey animals, checking corners, flinching at every sound. The second group came from above. Itachi's gaze tracked them through gaps in the ceiling structure, armored figures, their equipment marked with symbols he didn't recognize. 8 of them, moving with military precision. Their weapons were crude by his standards, but undeniably lethal slug throwers of some kind, augmented with what appeared to be chemical propellants. The armor was thick, designed to withstand significant punishment. His Sharingan analyzed firing angles, estimated ammunition capacity from weapon weight, calculated reload times from the mechanical action he could hear in the quiet. 7 seconds until the soldiers would have line of sight on the civilians. The soldiers didn't know the civilians were there yet, but their patrol pattern would intersect in moments. Then the third group appeared, and everything changed. They came through the walls themselves, reality tearing like paper to birth them into existence. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an instant. Itachi's instincts screamed warnings his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. These were not human. The Sharingan showed him patterns of energy that violated every principle of chakra. He understood corruption, given form madness with purpose. Cultists. 23 of them, their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to perceive. Some had been human once. Others had never been human at all. They carried blades that wept blood without being blooded, and their chanting filled the air with pressure that made reality itself feel thin. The civilians saw them and broke running blindly into the open. The soldiers above opened fire immediately, las beams cutting through the darkness in brilliant red lines. They weren't firing at the cultists. They were firing at everything that moved. Itachi understood in that instant these soldiers had standing orders to purge this entire sector. Civilian casualties were not a concern. They were the objective. The cultists laughed and charged. The civilians screamed. The soldiers maintained firing discipline, their weapons tracking targets with mechanical efficiency. In 5 seconds, everyone in this chamber would be dead or dying. Itachi moved. The body flicker was different here, affected by whatever fundamental laws governed this reality, but the principle held. He appeared between a cultist and a child, his hand finding the pressure point at the base of the cultist's skull with surgical precision. The cultist dropped without a sound. 3 more fell in rapid succession as Itachi's hands found joints and nerve clusters, each strike calculated to disable without killing. The soldiers above adjusted their aim, targeting him now. The Sharingan tracked 7 las beams, converging on his position. He was gone before they arrived, appearing 20 meters away in a different patch of shadow. Concrete dust erupted where he'd stood. He scattered more dust with a precisely placed kick to a support pillar, creating a screen that would reduce targeting accuracy by 70%. The cultists had noticed him now. 5 broke off from harrying the fleeing civilians to engage this new threat. Their blades moved in patterns that suggested familiarity with combat, but Itachi read their movements like text. Muscle tension, weight distribution, eye tracking, everything they would do was written in their bodies 3 seconds before they did it. He wove between their strikes, his hands finding chains that bound 2 civilians to rusted machinery. The chains were crude iron, weakened by decades of corrosion. A precisely angled strike shattered the weakest link without transferring enough force to break bones. The civilians ran. Another volley of las fire from above, forcing him to move again. The genjutsu was almost thoughtless. 3 cultists, their eyes meeting his Sharingan for a fraction of a second as they charged. He showed them the image of himself standing in 3 different locations simultaneously. They split their attack weapons, cutting through empty air, while Itachi moved through the space they'd left unguarded. More pressure point strikes. More disabled enemies who would wake in an hour whole but helpless. The soldiers were advancing down metal stairs, converging on his position. Professional tactics overlapping fields of fire communication via hand signals. The leader was marked by slightly different armor, a rank insignia Itachi didn't recognize, but could infer meaning from context. That one was analyzing his movements, trying to predict where he would appear next. Itachi showed him 3 false patterns before executing a 4th. The soldiers' formation broke as they attempted to cover angles that didn't matter. In that moment of confusion, he guided the last cluster of civilians toward an exit. His Sharingan had identified a maintenance shaft, partially hidden behind fallen debris. The wind patterns told him it led upward. The civilians understood without words, disappearing into the darkness. The cultists were regrouping now, drawing more of their number from whatever hell had spawned them. Their chanting intensified and reality buckled. A circle of corrupted symbols blazed into existence on the floor, traced in something that steamed and writhed. A summoning ritual. Whatever they intended to call through would make the current situation infinitely worse. Itachi's hand moved in seals, adapting techniques he'd known in another life to the strange chakra of this world. The jutsu was crude by his standards, improvised but functional. Flames erupted from his mouth in a controlled stream, not hot enough to kill the cultists, but sufficient to scatter their formation and disrupt the concentration required for their ritual. The summoning circle guttered and died. The last beams found him then. One grazed his shoulder, burning through cloth and the outer layer of skin. The pain was sharp, clean, informative. These weapons cauterized as they cut, dealing thermal damage rather than kinetic. He adjusted his evasion pattern accordingly, using structural pillars to break line of sight, forcing the soldiers to choose between careful aim and rapid fire. But they were learning. The leader had his measure now, anticipating his movements with increasing accuracy. The last beams were coming closer. Simultaneously, the cultists had abandoned their ritual in favor of overwhelming force, charging en masse with no regard for casualties. The civilians were gone, at least saved for whatever that meant in this nightmare world. Time to leave. Itachi's Sharingan had been tracking air currents throughout the engagement. 3 viable exit routes, but only one that led away from both pursuit vectors simultaneously. He moved toward it as another volley of lost fire carved the air where he'd been standing. The cultists followed predictable in their rage. The soldiers followed with more discipline, their weapons trained on his back. He was 15 meters from the exit when the throwing knife appeared in his hand. Not a killing throw, aimed instead at a specific stress point in an overhead girder the Sharingan had marked as critical. The girder shrieked and buckled. Half a ton of rusted metal crashed down behind him. Not enough to kill, but sufficient to block pursuit for the 30 seconds he needed. The darkness swallowed him, and Itachi ran deeper into the depths of this dead city, analyzing everything he'd learned. The soldiers served some kind of Imperium. He'd seen the eagles on their armor. The cultists served something else, something that existed outside normal reality. And caught between these forces were civilians disposable to both sides. 300 meters away, pressed against cold metal, in absolute darkness, Itachi allowed himself to breathe. His shoulder wound was minor, but would need attention. More concerning was the growing certainty that he was trapped in a world where compassion was considered weakness and mercy was heresy. Behind him, he heard the soldiers clearing the rubble. Their voices carried through the tunnels, distorted by distance and echo. They were calling him a psyker. The word meant nothing to him, but the tone was unmistakable witch demon heretic. They would hunt him now, not as an unknown, but as something they feared. The Sharingan faded, conserving chakra. In the darkness of the underhive, Itachi considered his situation with the same calm analysis he'd applied to every impossible mission Konoha had given him. He was alone in a hostile world marked as an enemy by its authorities, with nothing but his skills and the clothes on his back. He had been in worse situations. Not many, perhaps, but some. The wind still flowed from below, carrying scents of industry and decay. Somewhere in these depths, those civilians were trying to survive. And somewhere above, soldiers were planning his execution. Between those certainties lay a maze of metal and shadow. And Itachi had always excelled at navigating impossible spaces. He moved deeper into the darkness, silent as thought, already planning his next 3 moves. The underhive became Itachi's laboratory over the next 6 hours. He moved through levels of industrial decay, mapping patterns with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading environments for tactical advantage. Every sound told a story. The drip of contaminated water marked safe routes through collapsed passages. The groan of stressed metal warned of unstable floors. The distant echo of machinery revealed population centers to avoid. His shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, the cauterization from the last beam proving useful despite the pain. Itachi had treated worse injuries with less, though the nature of the damage concerned him. This world's weapons were designed for a specific kind of warfare, efficient and brutal. The soldiers who wielded them would be similarly efficient. He found a vantage point on the 5th level down where collapsed hab blocks created a maze of sight lines and firing positions. The Sharingan traced the geometry of the space, identifying 17 optimal sniper positions, 32 approach vectors, and 3 choke points that could be leveraged in close combat. Then he settled in to wait, because the soldiers would come. They had to. He had humiliated them, saved the people they'd been ordered to kill, and revealed capabilities that terrified them. Fear made people predictable. The first sign came 2 hours before dawn, a shift in air pressure that the Sharingan detected as thermal distortion. Someone was moving through the underhive with equipment sophisticated enough to mask their heat signature. Almost sophisticated enough. Itachi tracked the distortion as it passed 300 meters to his left, moving with inhuman grace toward a position that would offer clear observation of his current location. Sniper. Professional grade, using technology that bent light and heat around their body. Itachi remained motionless, breathing controlled chakra, suppressed to minimal levels. He counted heartbeats, measuring the sniper's rhythm. 68 beats per minute at rest, dropping to 54 when they settled into position. Combat veteran, experienced enough to control their physiology under stress. The shot didn't come. The sniper was observing, gathering data. Itachi appreciated the patience. It spoke to discipline and training that exceeded the soldiers from the manufactory. These were different hunters. Better hunters. The second hunter announced herself by not being there at all. Itachi's Sharingan caught the discrepancy first. A woman stumbling through the ruins, her clothing torn, blood on her face, moving with the uncoordinated desperation of someone fleeing for their life. Every detail was perfect, too perfect. The blood was the right consistency. The tears tracked through grime on her cheeks in exactly the pattern they should. Even the ragged breathing matched someone in the final stages of exhaustion. But her heartbeat was wrong. 72 beats per minute, steady as a metronome, with none of the variation that fear and exhaustion produced. Her center of gravity was too controlled, weight distributed like a dancer's rather than someone about to collapse. And her eyes, when they swept the area, moved in a tactical pattern that mapped threat vectors rather than searching desperately for safety. Infiltrator, shapeshifter, or extremely skilled at physical mimicry, probably enhanced given the level of control over her own biology. Itachi watched her stumble closer to his position, her performance flawless to any observer who couldn't read the microscopic tells that separated genuine trauma from trained simulation. Two hunters working in coordination. The sniper would be tracking his position through a scope, waiting for him to reveal himself by helping the woman. The infiltrator would close distance, probably carrying concealed weapons, optimized for close-quarters assassination. Standard tactic, well-executed, lethal against 99% of targets. Itachi had been the exception to standard tactics since he was 7 years old. He moved before either hunter could react, not toward the woman, but perpendicular to both their positions, using body flicker to cover 30 meters in the time it took a heart to beat twice. The sniper's rifle cracked a sound, unlike any firearm Itachi knew, more like reality tearing than a projectile launching. The round passed through the space where his head had been moving faster than sound and detonated against a support pillar with enough force to spray molten metal across 10 meters. Itachi was already gone, flowing through shadows toward a cluster of pipes that would break the sniper's sightline. The infiltrator dropped her pretense, moving with speed that confirmed augmentation. Mechanical enhancement servos and synthetic muscle woven into human tissue. She drew blades from sheaths that hadn't been visible a moment before, their edges crackling with energy fields. The Sharingan read her attack pattern 3 moves in advance. She was skilled, her techniques polished by decades of training and genetic optimization, but skill followed rules. Itachi had spent his life learning to read those rules in the tension of muscle fiber and the angle of approaching blades. He turned her charge into a stumble with nothing more than a shifted footfall, and the precise application of force against her leading knee, not enough to injure, but sufficient to disrupt her balance for the fraction of a second he needed. His hand found the nerve cluster at the base of her neck as she recovered. The infiltrator's body went rigid, muscles locking as her nervous system received contradictory signals. She would recover in 90 seconds, conscious but helpless. And Itachi was already moving again as the sniper's second shot carved through the space he'd occupied. The shot came from a different position. The sniper had relocated during the infiltrator's attack, using the distraction to reposition. Professional. Itachi's respect for these hunters increased even as he calculated their likely next moves. They were learning quickly the sniper wouldn't give him another opening to close distance, and the infiltrator had already demonstrated enough skill to make close combat dangerous. Time to change the parameters of engagement. Itachi ran toward the cluster of steam pipes he'd identified earlier, pipes that carried superheated waste from processing facilities deeper in the underhive. The Sharingan tracked metal fatigue, identifying joints weakened by decades of thermal stress. His kunai struck 3 specific points in rapid succession, and high-pressure steam exploded into the chamber, reducing visibility to near zero while simultaneously creating thermal interference that would blind the sniper's advanced optics. In the steam, Itachi created the genjutsu. Not the complex illusions he'd used on the cultists, but something simpler and more effective: auditory displacement. Footsteps echoed from 6 different directions, each with slightly different weight and rhythm. Each perfectly consistent with how someone of his size would sound, moving at different speeds across different surfaces. The sniper fired twice, each shot aimed at a different sound signature. Both missed. Itachi was moving through the blind spot their firing solution had created, using the muzzle flash location to triangulate their position. The Sharingan could read trajectory from bullet impact physics made visible. 3 more shots, 3 more miscalculated positions revealed. He found the sniper 60 seconds later, perched on a gantry that should have been impossible to reach without climbing equipment. They were good even seeing him approach through their scope, they maintained, firing discipline, taking the shot they had, rather than rushing and missing. The round passed close enough that Itachi felt it displace air against his cheek. But the Sharingan had read the finger tension before the trigger pull. He'd already begun moving, and his hand found the sniper's wrist as they ejected the spent round. Pressure point strike precise enough to numb their shooting hand without causing permanent damage. The rifle clattered to the ground below. The sniper drew a combat knife, with their offhand training overriding the shock of being disarmed. Itachi caught the blade between 2 fingers, reading the attack so perfectly that the edge stopped a millimeter from his palm. They stared at each other for a moment. The sniper's eyes visible now behind their optical equipment, wide with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Itachi struck again, this time targeting the nerve cluster that would induce unconsciousness without trauma. The sniper crumpled and he lowered them gently to the gantry floor. Alive. Whole. They would wake with nothing worse than a headache and questions their superiors wouldn't answer. The infiltrator had recovered by the time Itachi returned to ground level, her augmented physiology throwing off the nerve strike faster than a normal human could have. She stood in a combat stance, blades ready, but made no move to attack. Her eyes tracked him with analytical precision, recording everything for a report he knew she would have to make. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the infiltrator spoke, her voice stripped of the panicked affect she'd used before, now cold and professional. "You didn't kill us." Itachi said nothing. Words were unnecessary, and silence often communicated more than speech. He held her gaze, letting the Sharingan's glow answer for him. He could have killed them both a dozen times, chose not to, and they all knew it. The infiltrator sheathed her blade slowly, deliberately. Not surrender. She was too well trained to surrender, but acknowledgement. "What are you?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. Itachi understood perfectly. Not human in their eyes, not corrupted by the same forces as the cultists, but equally impossible by their understanding of natural law. He had become something their training hadn't prepared them for, an anomaly that resisted classification. "Not your enemy," Itachi said finally, the first words he'd spoken in this world, beyond the desperate whispers to civilians he'd saved. "Unless you make me one." He was gone before she could respond, vanishing into the underhive's depths with the same silent efficiency that had defined his arrival. Behind him, the infiltrator stood motionless for 30 seconds before moving to retrieve her unconscious partner. She would report everything to her superiors. They would analyze his capabilities, formulate new strategies, probably escalate their response. Good. Predictable enemies were manageable enemies. And Itachi needed time to understand this world, to map its power structures and moral landscapes. The civilians he'd saved were still in danger from the cultists, from the soldiers, from whatever systemic cruelty produced children with eyes too large for their faces and ribs visible through their skin. 3 kilometers deeper into the underhive, Itachi paused at a junction where old Imperial propaganda still clung to corroded walls. The images were faded, but their message was clear: obedience, sacrifice, service to something called the Emperor. The art style was brutal, depicting humans as nothing more than ammunition for a war machine that spanned galaxies. He had seen this before. Different symbols, different emperors, different justifications, but the same fundamental cruelty dressed in noble language. Konoha had taught him to recognize the gap between what power claimed to be and what it actually was. The Sharingan faded as Itachi moved deeper into darkness, his mind already dissecting the patterns behind this world's conflicts. The soldiers answered to someone. The cultists served something else. And somewhere in the tension between those forces, there would be a lever he could use, a point where intelligence could substitute for power, and one person could change an outcome that everyone else accepted as inevitable. He had done it before in a village that should have destroyed itself. He would do it again in a hive city that had already learned to call him monster. Above in the Arbite's command center, reports were being filed. 2 elite assassins incapacitated without lethal force. Target displaying capabilities classified as alpha-level psyker activity. Extreme caution advised. Capture preferred. Termination authorized if capture proves impossible. And in the depths, Itachi disappeared like smoke, already 3 moves ahead of hunters who had no idea they were still playing the first game. The cult hideout was empty when Itachi found it. But emptiness spoke volumes to someone trained to read absence as clearly as presence. The chamber had been cleared hastily. Drag marks in the dust showed where bodies or equipment had been removed. And scorch patterns on the walls suggested ritual fires extinguished in a hurry. But the cultists had left evidence behind, the kind that revealed more in what it tried to hide than in what it displayed openly. Itachi moved through the space methodically, his Sharingan cataloging details that accumulated into a picture his tactical mind assembled with disturbing clarity. The cultists had been here for months, maybe longer. Their corruption had carved symbols into stone and metal, warping reality in ways that made his chakra network recoil. But underneath that corruption, beneath the layers of madness and devotion, lay infrastructure that told a different story. The weapons cache in the corner was wrong. Cultists who worshipped chaos gods shouldn't have lasguns, and they certainly shouldn't have lasguns with Imperial serial numbers still visible on the charge packs. Itachi examined them without touching, reading manufacturing codes stamped into metal. Recent production. These weapons had come from Imperial armories within the last 6 months. The food stores were equally inconsistent. Cultists living in the underhive should have been subsisting on whatever they could scavenge or steal. Instead, Itachi found remnants of military rations, the kind issued to Imperial Guard units. The packaging bore supply requisition stamps, routing codes that indicated origin points in the upper hive. Someone with access to military logistics had been feeding these cultists, but it was the communications equipment that confirmed his suspicions. Hidden behind a false wall, disguised under layers of ritual desecration, Itachi found a voxcaster of military grade. The device had been damaged, probably during the cultists' hasty evacuation, but enough remained for the Sharingan to reconstruct its purpose. This wasn't crude scavenged technology repurposed by desperate heretics. This was current generation Imperial communications equipment, the kind issued to special operations units. Someone was running these cultists. Someone with resources, authority, and access to the very military infrastructure supposedly fighting to stop them. Itachi's mind moved through the logical chain with the same precision he'd used to unravel Konoha's political conspiracies. The Arbites had purge orders for this sector. The cultists had appeared in convenient numbers to justify those orders. The civilians were caught between forces that both claimed to oppose each other, yet whose conflict created the perfect conditions for exactly the outcome someone wanted. Depopulation of the Underhive through violence that could be blamed on heresy and chaos. He had seen this pattern before. Different village, different conspiracy, but the same fundamental structure: manufactured crisis-controlled opposition and civilians as acceptable casualties in someone's larger game. The question was, who benefited and why? Itachi spent another hour searching, finding more inconsistencies. Ritual circles drawn with materials that required industrial synthesis. Chaos symbols that were too perfect, replicated with the consistency of someone working from reference documents rather than mad inspiration. And everywhere, the subtle signs of external support equipment too sophisticated for the Underhive's scavenger economy organization, too structured for true chaos worship. The answer came from a data slate hidden under loose flooring, damaged, but still partially functional. The Sharingan read corrupted text through a cracked screen, piecing together requisition orders and supply manifests. Most of the data was destroyed, but enough remained to trace patterns. Shipments to specific coordinates, delivery schedules that coincided with cult activities. And at the bottom of one partially recovered document, a name: Inquisitor Halbrecht. Itachi committed the name to memory, along with every detail he could extract from the corrupted files. An inquisitor, the word implied investigation authority, someone tasked with rooting out corruption. Yet this inquisitor's name appeared on documents supplying the very cultists they should have been hunting. The pieces assembled into a picture that was both complex and elegantly simple. Halbrecht was running a false flag operation, using chaos cultists as controlled opposition to justify actions that served some larger agenda. The purge wasn't about stopping heresy. It was about clearing the Underhive for purposes Itachi didn't yet understand. And the civilians weren't collateral damage. They were the target. A sound from the entrance footsteps, multiple individuals moving with military precision. Itachi was gone before they entered, ascending through ventilation shafts to an observation position where he could watch without being seen. The Sharingan tracked 5 figures entering the cult hideout, their movements professional, their equipment marking them as different from the Arbites he'd encountered before. These were specialists. Their armor was lighter but more sophisticated, designed for mobility rather than direct combat. They carried equipment for evidence collection, methodically photographing and cataloging everything in the chamber. But their real purpose became clear when the leader began removing evidence, specifically anything that might trace back to Imperial supply chains. Itachi watched them work, memorizing faces and insignia. The leader bore marks that suggested high rank, possibly direct connection to this Inquisitor Halbrecht. They communicated via encrypted vox, but body language told stories that words would have only confirmed. These were people covering tracks, eliminating evidence, maintaining a conspiracy that required the Underhive to burn. The leader paused suddenly, head tilting in a gesture Itachi recognized they'd detected something. Not him specifically, but some indication that the hideout had been searched before their arrival. The specialist moved to the data slate Itachi had examined, studied it with focused intensity, then spoke into their vox with evident urgency. Itachi was 3 levels away when the hideout exploded. Not the wild detonation of improvised explosives, but the controlled demolition of someone erasing evidence they couldn't allow to survive. The blast was shape directed downward, collapsing the chamber into rubble that would require weeks to excavate. If anyone had still been in that hideout examining that evidence, they would have been vaporized instantly. But Itachi had recognized the demolition charges. During his initial sweep had noted their placement and calculated blast radius as a matter of routine tactical awareness. He'd been clear of the kill zone before the specialists had even entered the chamber. Old habits from Anbu's service preparations so ingrained it happened without conscious thought. Still, the message was clear. Someone knew he'd been investigating. Someone knew he'd found evidence. And someone was willing to kill to keep that evidence from reaching conclusions that threatened whatever plan they'd set in motion. Itachi needed more information, and there was only one place to get it. The upper hive took 4 hours to reach, navigating through maintenance passages and cargo lifts that the Sharingan's tactical analysis identified as least monitored. The architecture changed as he ascended the rust and decay of the underhive, giving way to functional infrastructure, then to spaces that showed actual maintenance and care. This was where the hive's rulers lived, insulated from the suffering below, by kilometers of industrial machinery and enforced separation. The inquisitorial facility was impossible to miss. It dominated an entire district, a fortress of authority that proclaimed its power through architecture alone. Itachi observed it from a distance, studying patrol patterns, identifying security systems, mapping the building's defensive layers with the same analytical precision he'd applied to every impossible infiltration Konoha had assigned him. He couldn't enter. Not yet. The security was too sophisticated, too layered with technologies he didn't fully understand. But he could observe, and observation yielded patterns. The Inquisitor himself appeared on a high balcony 3 hours into Itachi's surveillance. The man was unremarkable, physically middle-aged, military, bearing the kind of face that belonged to career authority figures in any world. But the Sharingan read more than appearance. It tracked micro-expressions, the subtle tells that separated sincerity from performance. Halbrecht stood on that balcony, addressing subordinates, his posture relaxed, his gestures measured. Itachi was too far to hear words, but words were unnecessary. The body language told him everything. This was a man comfortable with his power, confident in his control, presenting a carefully constructed image to everyone around him. But there were cracks. A hand that moved too smoothly to his side when a subordinate mentioned the underhive purge, suppressing what Itachi recognized as a self-soothing gesture. Eyes that tracked too carefully to exits when certain topics were discussed, betraying awareness of threat despite projected confidence. And most damning, a moment when Halbrecht thought himself unobserved, his expression settling into something cold and calculating that contradicted everything his public persona claimed. Itachi had interrogated enough liars to recognize the pattern. Halbrecht was performing righteousness, speaking in the language of duty and necessity, while orchestrating something he knew could never survive honest scrutiny. The cultists weren't his enemy. They were his tool. And the purge wasn't about protecting the Imperium. It was about removing obstacles to something else, some plan that required the underhive's population eliminated and its territories cleared. A hologram flickered to life beside Halbrecht communication from someone even higher in the authority chain. Itachi couldn't see the speaker, but he could see Halbrecht's reaction. Deference carefully measured with underlying tension that suggested complex political dynamics. Whatever Halbrecht was planning, it involved powers and players that extended beyond this single hive city. Itachi withdrew before security sweeps could detect his presence descending back into the underhive, with his suspicions confirmed. Halbrecht was the architect of the conspiracy, using chaos cultists as justification for purges that served ulterior purposes. The Arbites were tools implementing orders without understanding their true context. The assassins were weapons aimed at threats to a plan that required darkness to survive. And the civilians were fuel for a machine that consumed lives in service to ambitions that cared nothing for the suffering they caused. 3 kilometers down, in a hab block where families huddled in darkness, Itachi allowed himself a moment of something that might have been anger. He had left Konoha to escape exactly this pattern power, consuming innocence authority, justifying atrocity, individuals deemed acceptable sacrifices for abstract greater goods. Yet here he was in a world that had refined such cruelty to a galactic scale. But he had stopped it once. He could stop it again. Not by confronting Halbrecht directly, that would achieve nothing but his own death and the conspiracy's continuation. No, what Itachi needed was leverage. Information that could unravel the conspiracy evidence that could turn the Imperium's own machinery against the Inquisitor. And to get that evidence, he would need to do what he'd always done best. Move through shadows, gather information, build a case that couldn't be ignored, and strike at the moment when his opponent's power became their weakness. The Sharingan spun in darkness, already planning the next 7 moves. Halbrecht had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed the Chaos cultists were the real threat, that any resistance would come from corruption and madness. He hadn't considered what would happen when someone sane, someone skilled, someone who understood conspiracy and counter-conspiracy decided that the Inquisitor himself was the cancer that needed removing. Above in his fortress of authority, Halbrecht reviewed reports of the enhanced psyker disrupting operations in the Underhive. A nuisance, certainly, but manageable. The assassins would handle it, or the Purge would, or failing that the simple weight of Imperial power would crush one more anomaly that thought itself important. Below, Itachi moved through darkness, gathering evidence, building connections, preparing the trap that would catch an Inquisitor in his own conspiracy. The game had begun, and only one of them understood they were playing. The first sign came as a shift in air pressure, reality buckling under the weight, something forcing its way through barriers that shouldn't have been breachable. Itachi felt it 3 seconds before the screaming started, his chakra network recoiling from corruption that made the previous cult encounters seem like whispers compared to this roar. Then the Underhive erupted. 6 locations simultaneously spread across the lower levels in a pattern too coordinated to be anything but planned. Reality tore open at each point, spilling horrors that physics shouldn't have allowed, and sanity couldn't comprehend. The cultists came through in waves, no longer the scattered cells Itachi had encountered before, but organized forces moving with military precision toward civilian population centers. From his position on level 7, the Sharingan tracked the unfolding catastrophe with tactical clarity. The cult forces weren't simply attacking. They were executing a coordinated operation, driving civilians toward kill zones where Arbites units waited with weapons ready. Hammer and anvil. The cultists were the hammer driving prey toward the anvil of Imperial Purge teams who would claim they had no choice but to fire on everything that moved. Halbrecht's endgame finally revealed. Not gradual depopulation, but mass casualty event blamed entirely on chaos incursion, justified completely by Imperial doctrine. Thousands would die in hours, and the official record would call it tragic necessity rather than orchestrated massacre. Itachi moved before conscious thought completed the analysis. The civilians nearest him were already running 37 individuals fleeing toward what they thought was safety. But the Sharingan identified as a convergence point, where 3 cult groups would intercept them in 90 seconds. He reached them first, appearing from shadows, with the kind of timing that made his intervention seem like coincidence rather than calculation. The cultists hit the intersection 12 seconds after Itachi had redirected the civilians down a maintenance passage that the Arbites monitoring systems hadn't updated in their databases for 3 years. The cultists found empty space where they'd expected victims, their coordination disrupted by the simple absence of targets they'd been herding towards specific coordinates. But there were too many civilians, too many cult groups, too many moving pieces for one person to redirect. Itachi's mind calculated possibilities at the speed the Sharingan could process visual data mapping the Underhive's geography against population densities and threat vectors. He needed to create safe zones areas where civilians could shelter, while Cult and Arbite's forces eliminated each other in the chaos they'd jointly created. The old water treatment facility on level 9 was the first. Abandoned for decades, its access tunnels collapsed. But the Sharingan had identified structural weaknesses during previous reconnaissance that could be exploited. Itachi planted explosive notes at 3 critical support points. Not enough to destroy the facility, but sufficient to trigger a controlled collapse that sealed the main entrance while leaving emergency exits open only to those who knew they existed. He guided 26 civilians there in 3 trips using genjutsu to make pursuing cultists see empty corridors, while his charges moved through spaces that appeared blocked, but the Sharingan had identified as passable. The last civilian through, he triggered the collapse. The entrance sealed with a roar of falling metal and stone. Anyone monitoring would assume the facility destroyed everyone inside dead. The civilians huddled in darkness, terrified, but alive. The second safe zone was a cargo bay that maintenance records showed as condemned. Itachi led 43 civilians there, through routes that required moving through active combat zones. The Sharingan tracked last beam trajectories, predicted grenade throws, calculated the precise timing required to move between volleys. He didn't fight unless forced to, and when forced to, his strikes were surgical disable the cultist blocking the path, disrupt the Arbite's fire pattern with a precisely thrown stone that triggered their target identification protocols in the wrong direction. Create chaos that covered civilian movement. A cult leader spotted him during the 3rd extraction, a towering figure whose body had been warped by corruption into something that barely resembled human origin. The thing moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible for its mass blades, extending from arms that bent at too many angles. Itachi engaged it for exactly 23 seconds, long enough for the civilians behind him to reach the next corridor. Not long enough for the fight to draw additional cult forces. The Sharingan read the creature's attack patterns with the same precision it read human movement, finding the rhythm beneath the chaos, the predictability within apparent randomness. He wove between strikes that could have bisected him, his hands finding pressure points on anatomy that was barely recognizable as having nerves, but still followed biological principles. The cult leader collapsed, not dead, but paralyzed, and Itachi was gone before it hit the ground. The Arbites were adapting their tactics to account for his presence. Itachi noticed the shift after the 5th evacuation. They were no longer simply firing on everything that moved. Someone had given them new orders, probably realizing that indiscriminate slaughter was being undermined by someone redirecting civilians away from kill zones. Now they were trying to predict his movements, setting up ambush positions along routes he might use. Good. Predictable responses to unpredictable movement meant they were thinking tactically, and tactical thinking created patterns he could exploit. He fed them 3 false patterns in succession, appearing to favor certain routes and evacuation points, while actually using different paths entirely. By the 6th evacuation, the Arbites had concentrated forces at positions Itachi had no intention of approaching, leaving gaps in their coverage that the Sharingan identified and exploited. But the cultists were escalating. Whatever leash Halbrecht had used to control them was either breaking or being deliberately released. Reality tears expanded, spawning things that made the earlier cultists seem benign. Demon-touched entities that moved through walls that twisted space around themselves, that projected corruption as a physical force that made Itachi's chakra network scream warnings. He encountered one in a corridor while leading a group of 18 civilians, mostly children and elderly. The thing was massive, barely contained by the tunnel's dimensions, its presence making reality itself feel thin and uncertain. The civilians couldn't move. Terror had frozen them more effectively than any paralysis jutsu. Itachi stepped forward, placing himself between the demon and the civilians. The Sharingan spun, analyzing energy patterns that violated every principle of chakra manipulation he understood. This wasn't ninjutsu or genjutsu. This was something else, something that existed outside the frameworks he'd trained his entire life to master. But corruption had patterns. Everything had patterns, and patterns could be disrupted. He formed seals, adapting fire release to target not the demon itself, but the space around it, the thin places where reality had been weakened to allow its presence. The flames weren't meant to burn, they were meant to reinforce, to cauterize the tears in space-time that the demon used to anchor itself to material existence. The demon shrieked as the flames sealed the rifts, its form becoming less stable, less real. It lashed out claws, raking through stone. But Itachi was already moving his strikes, targeting the points where corruption met reality, disrupting the demon's coherence with precise applications of force that the Sharingan calculated to exploit structural weaknesses in its existence. The thing collapsed into itself, not dead, but banished, forced back through the tears it had used to enter this reality. The corridor stabilized, the pressure of wrongness fading. Behind Itachi, the civilians remained frozen, their eyes wide with incomprehension at what they'd witnessed. He didn't speak. Words would have required explanations he couldn't provide, and wouldn't help their survival. He simply gestured them forward, and they followed, too shocked to do anything else. The night stretched on, measured in extractions and close calls and increasingly desperate gambles. Itachi mapped 7 safe zones across the Underhive's lower levels, distributed to prevent any single discovery from compromising all the civilians he'd sheltered. Each zone held between 20 and 60 individuals, hidden in places that monitoring systems had forgotten or never properly mapped. But casualties were mounting despite his efforts. He couldn't be everywhere, couldn't save everyone. The Underhive was vast, the cult forces numerous, and the Arbites fire teams efficient. Itachi had saved hundreds, but thousands more were dying in the chaos he had no ability to prevent. The assassins appeared during his 12th extraction, both of them working in coordination, but with obvious reluctance. The Vindicar's shot missed by a wider margin than skill alone would explain a warning shot forcing him to change course, but not intended to kill. The Calidus intercepted him at the next junction, blades ready but stance more defensive than aggressive. They stood there for 3 seconds, Itachi and the 2 assassins, while civilians fled through the corridor behind him. The Calidus's eyes tracked the fleeing families, then returned to Itachi. She could kill him, probably. Together, she and the Vindicar had the tactical advantage. But killing him meant the civilians behind him would die, and he saw the moment she performed that calculation and didn't like the answer. The Calidus stepped aside. The Vindicar's rifle tracked Itachi as he moved past, but didn't fire. He nodded once, acknowledgement between professionals, and continued. Behind him, he heard the Calidus engaging cultists who'd been pursuing, buying him time he hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. The equation was shifting. The assassins had been sent to kill him, but watching him save civilians while their own orders resulted in civilian deaths had created cognitive dissonance their training hadn't prepared them for. They were questioning. Not defecting, not yet, but questioning. Questions were leverage. And leverage was what Itachi needed. The Omega event came at hour 6, when structural damage from the fighting triggered a catastrophic failure in the ancient infrastructure of level 12. The Sharingan saw it developing microfractures in support columns, spreading stress redistribution, creating cascade failure that would collapse 3 entire levels. 40,000 tons of metal and stone would fall. And while most of the falling debris would hit already evacuated zones, one section would crush the hab block where Itachi had sheltered 83 civilians. He had 17 seconds to reach them, and maybe 30 seconds to evacuate them before the collapse. The math was impossible. Even at full speed, using body flicker at the edge of what his chakra reserves could sustain, he could get there in 14 seconds. But evacuation would take minutes they didn't have. The Sharingan calculated alternatives, running scenarios at desperate speed. Redirect the collapse, no. The structural failure was too advanced. Reinforce the shelter, no, nothing he could do would support 40,000 tons. Warn them and hope they could evacuate themselves. No panic would kill them as surely as falling debris. One option remained. One technique he'd hoped never to use in this world, because it would reveal capabilities that the Imperium would classify as maximum threat psyker manifestation. But 83 lives, including children whose only crime was being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, were worth whatever consequences would follow. Itachi reached the hab block with 3 seconds to spare. The civilians looked up as he appeared, hope and fear, mixed in expressions he'd seen too many times in his life. Above them, support beams shrieked their final warnings. The Sharingan became the Mangekyo, and Susanu's skeletal frame materialized around the hab block like a titan's ribcage. Not the full manifestation that would have required chakra he didn't have, but enough to create a framework of energy that could distribute impact forces. 40,000 tons of metal and stone struck Susanu's bones, and Itachi felt the impact through every fiber of his body chakra reserves, draining at catastrophic rates to maintain the technique. 10 seconds. He held for 10 seconds while debris rained down around them. Susanu's form shuddering under stress it was never designed to withstand. 8, 6, 4. The last major section fell, and he released the technique before chakra depletion could render him unconscious. Susanu faded like dissipating mist, leaving Itachi on his knees in a circle of protected space, while devastation surrounded them on all sides. The civilians stared at him with expressions that contained more fear than gratitude, seeing something their understanding of reality couldn't accommodate. But they were alive. That was what mattered. Later, in the aftermath, when the cult forces had been pushed back and the Arbites had withdrawn to consolidate positions, Itachi found a vantage point where he could observe the Underhive's new geography. The fighting had killed thousands, but his interventions had saved hundreds more than would have survived without them. And across the Hive's communication channels, reports were flooding in about the enhanced Psyker, who had manifested reality-warping defensive abilities of unprecedented power. Halbrecht would be reading those reports now, recalculating his assessment of the threat Itachi represented. Good. Let him worry. Let him make mistakes born of fear and uncertainty. Because while Halbrecht had been orchestrating chaos, Itachi had been gathering evidence. And while the Inquisitor thought the night's events proved his narrative of chaos corruption requiring purge response, Itachi had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of assassins who'd watched him save civilians while following orders that killed them. The game was entering its final phase. Halbrecht controlled the official narrative and the institutional power, but Itachi controlled something more valuable, the truth and the will to ensure it couldn't remain hidden. In his fortress above Halbrecht, studied reports and declared the night a tragic victory against chaos incursion. In the depths below, Itachi tended to his injuries and prepared for the confrontation that would expose everything Halbrecht had built his power upon. The crow was ready to reveal itself, and the dead city would learn that some darkness couldn't be controlled, only confronted. The inquisitorial fortress stood as a monument to authority, its architecture designed to inspire awe and dread in equal measure. 60 meters of reinforced ceramite and adamantium, studded with defensive emplacements, monitored by sensor arrays that could detect a rat's heartbeat at 100 meters. It was built to withstand siege, designed to repel armies, and Itachi planned to walk in through the front door. Not literally, but close enough to make no practical difference. He had spent 18 hours preparing after the chaos uprising ended. Not resting, though his body demanded it. Not treating injuries beyond the minimum required for function. Preparing. The Sharingan had mapped the fortress during his previous surveillance, but mapping wasn't enough. He needed to understand patterns, guard rotations, shift changes, the small human inefficiencies that perfect systems always contained, because humans operated them. The fortress ran on schedules. Everything from patrol routes to communication checks followed timetables designed by someone who valued regularity over adaptability. That regularity was a vulnerability to someone who could read patterns as fluently as most people read text. Itachi infiltrated during the shift change between 3rd and 4th watch when tired guards departed and fresh replacements arrived, creating a 3-minute window where attention was divided between routine and transition. He entered through a maintenance duct that the Sharingan had identified as undersized for human passage. But not for someone who could control their breathing, compress their ribcage, and move with the patience of someone who'd spent years in Anbu, learning that impossible infiltrations were merely improbable ones. Inside the fortress was a labyrinth of corridors and checkpoints, each designed to funnel intruders toward kill zones, while legitimate personnel moved through authorized routes. Itachi used neither. He traveled through spaces between spaces, maintenance crawlways, utility passages, the forgotten infrastructure that supported the fortress's visible power structure. The Sharingan guided him through darkness, tracking heat signatures, through walls, identifying patrol patterns from footstep rhythms, predicting camera sweep patterns from the mechanical sound of servos turning. He moved like water through cracks, visible only when he chose to be. And he chose invisibility. 3 times he encountered security that couldn't be avoided. The first was a checkpoint where thermal scanners would detect any living presence in the crawl space he needed to traverse. Itachi dropped his body temperature through chakra control, slowing his heart rate to levels that mimicked ambient temperature fluctuations. The scanner swept past him, registering nothing worth investigating. The second encounter was a pressure-sensitive floor in a corridor he needed to cross. The Sharingan calculated weight distribution points, identifying the structural beams that supported the panels from below. Itachi crossed on those beams, distributing his weight across 4 points simultaneously in a configuration that kept individual pressure below detection thresholds. The third was a guard who deviated from patrol routes, moving through a section that should have been empty. Itachi waited in shadow as the guard passed within arm's reach, close enough that he could count the man's respirations. The guard paused, instinct warning him of something wrong and moving toward his weapon. Itachi remained perfectly still, breathing synchronized to the guard's own rhythm, presenting no movement for peripheral vision to detect. The guard stood there for 30 seconds before shaking his head and continuing his patrol unaware how close he'd come to forcing Itachi to choose between mission compromise and non-lethal incapacitation. The central records chamber was on the fortress's 3rd level, buried deep enough to be secure but accessible enough that authorized personnel could reach it efficiently. Itachi found it behind 3 locked doors and 2 biometric checkpoints, none of which were designed to stop someone who could use the Sharingan to read security codes from the microscopic patterns of finger oils on keypads. Inside rows of data terminals, stretched into gloom, connected to cogitator banks that stored everything the Inquisition had recorded about this sector's operations. Halbrecht's entire conspiracy would be documented here, not openly, but buried in files that cross-referenced supply requisitions with deployment schedules with casualty reports. The kind of documentation that revealed truth to anyone who knew how to read between officially sanitized lines. Itachi didn't have time to search manually. The shift change window was closing, and soon guards would return to normal alertness levels. He needed something that would do more than expose Halbrecht. He needed something that would expose Halbrecht in a way that couldn't be suppressed or explained away. The Sharingan spun, and Itachi accessed the terminal with hands that had learned to navigate technology through observation rather than training. The interface was crude compared to what his world's sensors could achieve, but functional. He searched for three things: supply manifests that traced Imperial resources to cult hands, communication logs that showed coordination between inquisitorial forces and cult activities, and casualty projections that revealed the purge's true scope. He found all three within 6 minutes. The data was encrypted, but encryption meant patterns, and patterns meant vulnerability to someone whose eyes could read code as naturally as they read combat intentions. The Sharingan broke through security layers designed to resist dedicated hacking teams, processing information faster than the cogitators could implement their defensive protocols. But raw data wasn't enough. Halbrecht could dismiss data as fabricated, as misinterpretation, as the ravings of a psyker whose word carried no weight against an inquisitor's authority. Itachi needed something more compelling, more immediate, more impossible to deny. He needed Halbrecht himself. The Inquisitor's private chambers were on the fortress's highest level, positioned to overlook the hive city he administered with absolute authority. Getting there meant traversing corridors where Itachi's presence would be detected, where stealth would fail, where combat would be unavoidable. But the Sharingan had identified something during the record search. Halbrecht kept a secondary office 3 levels down, a space where he conducted business too sensitive for official record. Itachi found it behind an unmarked door that the Sharingan had noted Halbrecht entering during previous surveillance. Inside the room was Spartan but functional, containing communication equipment and data storage that existed outside the fortress's official inventory. This was where Halbrecht coordinated aspects of his conspiracy that couldn't risk even encrypted official channels. And it was where Halbrecht came every night at the same hour to review operations and send orders to subordinates who believed they served the Imperium's interests rather than an Inquisitor's ambition. Itachi waited in darkness, chakra suppressed to barely detectable levels, counting minutes until footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. The door opened and Halbrecht entered a lone protocol violation, but one that made sense for someone who couldn't risk witnesses to activities that would constitute heresy if properly understood. The Inquisitor noticed nothing wrong until the door sealed behind him, and the Sharingan's glow illuminated the darkness. He reached for his weapon with commendable speed, but Itachi was faster. Not attacking, not yet. Simply revealing himself, making his presence known in a way that gave Halbrecht the choice between reaching for weapons and reaching for answers. Halbrecht chose answers, his hand freezing halfway to his holster. His eyes were wide, but his voice remained controlled, decades of authority training, overriding immediate fear. "You're the psyker from the Underhive." Itachi didn't respond. Words would come, but establishing dynamic mattered more than immediate conversation. He wanted Halbrecht off balance, uncertain making decisions, from reaction rather than planning. The Inquisitor's eyes tracked the room, noting exits, calculating odds, probably triggering some kind of silent alarm Itachi had already identified and disabled. "You've made a grave mistake coming here. This fortress contains enough firepower to eliminate 1,000 psykers of your caliber." Still, Itachi remained silent, letting the Sharingan's glow answer for him. He'd moved through this fortress like smoke appearing in Halbrecht's private office, despite security designed to prevent exactly such infiltration. The implication was clear: firepower meant nothing if it couldn't be brought to bear. Halbrecht's expression shifted, moving through calculation toward something that might have been respect. You want to negotiate. You've demonstrated capabilities, now you want leverage for what permission to leave asylum, somewhere beyond my reach. The Mangekyo Sharingan replaced the standard Tomoe, and Itachi spoke for the first time since entering the fortress. Truth. Tsukuyomi activated before Halbrecht could process the word. The genjutsu didn't work quite the same way in this world. The fundamental laws of reality were different. Chakra interacted with consciousness through mechanisms that violated principles Itachi had trained his entire life to master. But the core principle held. The Mangekyo could show people truth by trapping them in illusion that forced confrontation with what they tried to hide even from themselves. In Tsukuyomi's space-time became negotiable. Seconds stretched into hours, minutes became days, and Halbrecht experienced his own conspiracy from perspectives he had never considered. Itachi showed him the civilians dying while following orders the Inquisitor had given. The cultists receiving weapons from supply chains Halbrecht controlled. The Arbites killing innocents while believing they protected the Imperium from chaos. Each moment of coordination between forces that should have been enemies, each death that served ambitions, Halbrecht told himself were necessary. But Itachi didn't stop at showing what Halbrecht had done. He showed what would come next, the purge expanding beyond the underhive, consuming hab blocks and industrial sectors as Halbrecht's plan required increasingly large populations, cleared for whatever purpose drove his conspiracy. Millions dead, billions grieving, and Halbrecht's name recorded in history as either hero or monster, depending entirely on whether his ultimate goal succeeded or failed. And finally, Itachi showed Halbrecht himself. Not the image the Inquisitor presented to the world, but the reality beneath a man who'd convinced himself that atrocity became acceptable, when framed as necessity, that individual lives became meaningless when weighed against abstract greater goods, that power justified whatever power required for its maintenance. The genjutsu released after 3 subjective hours that occupied 3 objective seconds. Halbrecht collapsed, his knees hitting the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he looked up, his eyes held something Itachi had seen before in people confronted with truths they'd successfully hidden from themselves. "You don't understand," Halbrecht said, voice hoarse. "The Imperium requires—" "Nothing that needs lies to justify it," Itachi interrupted. "If your actions were righteous, you wouldn't hide them. If your goals were noble, you wouldn't require innocent deaths to achieve them." Halbrecht's hand moved toward his weapon again, slower this time, knowing the gesture was futile but making it anyway, because authority figures couldn't acknowledge powerlessness without unraveling everything they'd built themselves upon. "You think you've won, even if you kill me, even if you expose everything, the Imperium will continue. Someone else will take my position. The machine doesn't stop because one cog breaks." "I know," Itachi said. "I've seen machines like yours before. They don't stop. They can only be shown for what they are forced to acknowledge, their own brutality. Made to see themselves in mirrors they can't dismiss." The Sharingan captured everything: Halbrecht's expression, his posture. The minute tells that indicated someone performing confidence while experiencing despair. And more importantly, it recorded the conversation through a technique Itachi had adapted from Konoha's intelligence division, storing sensory information that could be replayed not just as memory, but as evidence others could witness through genjutsu. "You can't prove anything," Halbrecht said, but the words lacked conviction. "Your word against mine. A psyker's testimony versus an inquisitor's authority." Itachi moved to the terminal in Halbrecht's secret office, the one containing communications that existed outside official channels. His hands moved across controls with the efficiency of someone who'd already mapped the interface through Sharingan observation. Files opened displaying supply manifests, coordination orders, casualty projections, everything that proved Halbrecht had orchestrated the very chaos he claimed to fight against. "Not my word," Itachi said. "Yours." The terminal's display flickered, then stabilized as Itachi activated protocols buried in the fortress's communication network. Not the official channels that Halbrecht controlled, but emergency broadcast systems designed to function during catastrophic events. Systems that couldn't be suppressed without physically destroying equipment spread across the entire Hive city. Holographic projectors throughout the fortress activated simultaneously, displaying the evidence Itachi had compiled. Supply manifests traced to Halbrecht's authorization codes. Communication logs showing coordination between inquisitorial forces and cult activities. Casualty projections that revealed the Purge's true scope, and most damning recorded conversations where Halbrecht discussed the conspiracy with subordinates who believed they served the Imperium's interests. But Itachi didn't stop at the fortress. The emergency broadcast protocols extended to public spaces throughout the Hive, to Arbit stations and civilian gathering points, to anywhere authority communicated with populations. Thousands of displays across multiple levels simultaneously showed what Inquisitor Halbrecht had done, made undeniable by the man's own recorded words and documented actions. Halbrecht stared at his own image on the terminal display, watching himself discuss purge strategies with subordinates, hearing himself authorize supply shipments to cult forces. The color drained from his face as he understood the scope of what Itachi had accomplished. Not just exposure within inquisitorial circles where truth could be suppressed, but public revelation that reached populations who had suffered under policies they'd been taught to accept as necessary. "You've destroyed yourself," Halbrecht said, voice hollow. "The Imperium will classify you as maximum threat psyker. They'll hunt you across systems. There's nowhere in the galaxy you'll be safe." "I know," Itachi said again, "but they'll remember. The people you tried to erase will remember someone showed them they mattered. The subordinates you manipulated will remember that authority can be questioned. And you will remember that power without accountability eventually answers for its crimes." Alarms shrieked throughout the fortress as security finally registered the communications breach. Footsteps thundered in corridors converging on Halbrecht's location. Itachi had perhaps 90 seconds before armed forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. He moved toward the window, the same window where he'd observed Halbrecht days earlier. The glass was reinforced, designed to withstand weapon fire. The Sharingan identified stress points, and a precisely angled strike shattered it. Wind rushed in from the Hive's toxic atmosphere, carrying the scent of promethium and decay. "This isn't justice," Halbrecht said behind him. "You've proven nothing except that you're as willing to cause chaos as the forces you claim to oppose." Itachi paused at the window's edge, looking back at the Inquisitor who'd orchestrated thousands of deaths in service to ambitions Itachi still didn't fully understand. Justice requires institutions that care about truth. Your Imperium doesn't. But truth exists whether institutions acknowledge it or not. People will choose what to do with what I've shown them. The door burst open, guards flooding in with weapons raised. Itachi was already gone. Stepping through the shattered window into night air, his body falling 300 meters, while the Sharingan calculated landing vectors that would convert terminal velocity into survivable impact force through chakra-enhanced muscle control. He hit the lower-level rooftop at an angle that distributed momentum across roll and recovery. Emerged running already 3 moves ahead of pursuers who were still registering his departure. Behind him, the fortress erupted into chaos as guards scrambled to lock down a facility whose security had been revealed as theater rather than substance. Across the Hive, on thousands of displays, Halbrecht's recorded voice continued explaining how he'd manufactured chaos to justify Purge's coordinated cultist attacks, to create casualties, manipulated imperial institutions to serve personal ambitions. The broadcasts couldn't be stopped. Itachi had triggered them through systems designed to function independently during emergencies, distributed through networks that required physical destruction to silence. In Arbite stations, officers watched their inquisitor describe using them as unwitting executioners. In hab blocks, civilians saw documented proof that their loved ones had died serving someone's political theater rather than protecting the Imperium. And in assassinorum facilities, the Kalidas and Vindicare watched evidence that confirmed what they'd begun suspecting. During the Chaos Uprising, they'd been hunting the wrong target. Itachi moved through the Underhive's depths, following routes he'd mapped over days of operation. Pursuit would come was already coming, but pursuit required coordination that the Hive's authorities no longer possessed. Halbrecht's revelation had fractured command structures, created doubt in subordinates who'd trusted his authority, turned hunters into questioners who no longer knew what orders deserved following. 3 kilometers down, in the abandoned manufactory, where light never reached, Itachi finally stopped running. His chakra reserves were depleted, his body exhausted injuries from the Chaos Uprising, demanding attention he'd deferred too long. But he'd accomplished what he'd come to do. Not victory, there was no victory in a world like this one, but truth. Forced into open where it couldn't be ignored, couldn't be suppressed, couldn't be dismissed as psyker manipulation. The Imperium would respond. Probably classify him as maximum threat heretic. Definitely hunt him with resources that dwarfed anything Halbrecht had commanded. But they would do so knowing that someone had looked at their machinery of cruelty and said no. That power had been held accountable even briefly, even imperfectly, by someone who refused to accept that atrocity became acceptable when authority sanctioned it. Above in the inquisitorial fortress, Halbrecht sat in his private office surrounded by guards who no longer looked at him with respect, but with questions they couldn't quite formulate. His conspiracy was unraveling his authority, undermined by evidence he couldn't deny, because it came from his own records and recordings. Below in darkness, that should have been oppressive, but felt almost peaceful, Itachi allowed himself to rest. Not sleep that would be too dangerous until he'd cleared the hive entirely, but rest. The kind of rest that came from knowing he'd done what needed doing, regardless of personal cost. The dead city had seen its truth spoken. What the living chose to do with that truth was beyond his control. But they would never be able to claim ignorance again. Never able to pretend they didn't know what had been done in the Imperium's name. And somewhere in the darkness, civilians sheltered in safe zones he'd created alive, because someone had decided their lives mattered more than orders or doctrine or the convenient narratives that made atrocity palatable. Itachi's Sharingan faded, conserving the last dregs of chakra he would need for extraction. The game had reached its conclusion. Now came the more difficult part, escape from a world that would hunt him, until either he found a way off planet or his body failed under the accumulated weight of injuries and exhaustion. But he'd escaped impossible situations before. And this time, at least, he'd leave behind something more lasting than corpses and secrets. He'd leave behind proof that even in the grim darkness of the far future, individual choice could matter. That mercy wasn't weakness. That truth once revealed couldn't be completely suppressed, no matter how powerful the institutions that tried. The crow prepared to leave the dead city. But first, it would rest its wings. The hunt began at dawn. If dawn meant anything in a hive city where artificial light decided the boundary between day and night. Itachi listened to it from 3 kilometers down, tracking pursuit forces through sound and vibration patterns that traveled through the Underhive's infrastructure. Arbeits units, inquisitorial teams, and something else, the distinctive quiet of assassins moving with professional efficiency through spaces where noise would have been tactically disadvantageous. His body was failing. Not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately incapacitate him, but in the accumulated damage of sustained operations without adequate recovery. The shoulder wound had reopened during his escape from the fortress. Chakra reserves were depleted beyond what meditation alone could restore in the time frame his situation allowed. An exhaustion pressed against consciousness with the weight of weeks compressed into days. But failing and failed were different states, and Itachi had learned long ago how to function in the space between them. He moved through the Underhive's lowest levels following routes the Sharingan had mapped during previous operations. Not the fastest paths, those would be monitored. Not the obvious escape vectors, those would be ambushed. Instead, he chose routes that required patience over speed, silence over efficiency paths that circled back and doubled through themselves, in patterns that made tracking him require resources the pursuit forces would need elsewhere. The Arbeits were frustrated. Itachi could hear it in their communications, vox chatter that echoed through empty manufactories and abandoned hab blocks. They'd expected to corner him, within hours, trap him through superior numbers and coordinated tactics. Instead, he led them through spaces that negated numerical advantage, where tight corridors and collapsed passages made formations impossible and sight lines became worthless. He'd left false trails at 7 locations as traces of his passage that would lead pursuit toward dead ends, while he moved through parallel routes they hadn't considered. Not deception through misdirection, the Arbeits were too professional for simple tricks, but through presenting them with evidence that matched their assumptions about how someone in his condition would move. The assassins were more concerning. The Calidus found him twice appearing in spaces where appearance should have been impossible. Both times they held brief standoffs, measured in heartbeats, her weapons ready but not attacking his hands, positioned for defense but not striking. Both times she let him pass after seconds that felt like negotiations conducted through body language and shared understanding that words couldn't have improved. The Vindicar was more direct. His shot came through a gap in collapsed infrastructure that the Sharingan identified 2 seconds before the trigger pull. Itachi moved, and the round struck where his head had been detonating with precision that suggested warning rather than termination. The sniper was providing harassment, not execution, making his continued presence in the Underhive unsustainable without actually ending him. Itachi understood. The assassins had orders to eliminate him, but those orders came from an institution whose credibility he'd just shattered. They were professionals executing assignments, but professionals capable of recognizing when assignments conflicted with observations. He'd saved civilians. They'd watched him do it. And now, they were creating the appearance of aggressive pursuit, while actually driving him toward extraction rather than elimination. He wouldn't have expected mercy from them. Suspected they wouldn't characterize it as mercy themselves. But whatever term applied, they were giving him the margin he needed to reach his exit vector alive. The Underhive's deepest levels were different from the industrial decay above. This far-down civilization had failed so completely that infrastructure had reverted to geological formations, metal and stone, blending into configurations that neither technology nor nature alone could have produced. Water dripped from impossible angles. Gravity felt negotiable in spaces where reality's laws applied inconsistently. And the darkness was absolute, requiring Sharingan activation just to perceive basic geometry. Itachi found the access shaft during his second day of operations as a vertical passage that descended beyond where his chakra-enhanced vision could penetrate. Maintenance records from the inquisitorial databases had mentioned it a borehole from the Hive's earliest construction. sunk through bedrock toward mineral deposits that had never materialized. The hole descended 3 kilometers, ending in aquifer chambers that connected to underground rivers flowing toward the hive's exterior. It was suicide to attempt without proper equipment. The descent would be vertical in absolute darkness, through spaces that could flood without warning or contain atmospheric conditions incompatible with human survival. But Itachi had executed suicide missions before and survived them by treating suicide as merely improbable rather than impossible. He began the descent chakra control, allowing him to adhere to walls that were more liquid than solid. The Sharingan tracked his progress through darkness, identifying handholds in stone, warning him of sections where the wall's composition wouldn't support his weight. Down. Always down. Toward water that represented either escape or drowning, depending on whether the underground river actually led to exterior or simply circled back into the hive's recycling systems. Halfway down pursuit, forces reached the shaft's entrance. Itachi heard them above their lights, cutting through darkness like searchlights through night. Voices echoed down, distorted by distance and acoustics into unintelligible sound. Someone fired into the shaft, testing, probably seeing if they could flush him through direct fire. The rounds ricocheted wildly, their trajectories unpredictable in the vertical space. Itachi pressed himself flat against the wall, trusting chakra adhesion to hold him, while metal death sang around him. One round passed close enough to feel wind displacement. Another struck the wall 3 meters below, spraying stone fragments that cut his face. Then the firing stopped. Not because they'd achieved their objective, but because someone above had calculated that blind fire into vertical shafts was as likely to kill their own people as the target. Voices again arguing, then silence. They wouldn't follow. This descent was beyond what their equipment allowed, and they knew it. Itachi continued down into darkness that felt increasingly like falling rather than climbing. His chakra reserves were critical now, barely sufficient to maintain wall adhesion. If they failed, if he lost concentration even momentarily, he would fall 3 kilometers into water that would kill him as efficiently as striking stone. His hands touched water 2 hours into the descent. Not the trickle of condensation he'd been encountering, but actual flow, a river, moving through subterranean channels with current that suggested connection to larger systems. The Sharingan couldn't penetrate water to determine depth or direction, but sound analysis suggested the river moved away from the hive's center, potentially toward exterior drainage systems. Itachi released his grip on the wall, let himself fall the final meters, and hit water that was colder than ice should have been. The current caught him, immediately pulling him into darkness, where the Sharingan was useless, and chakra control was reduced to maintaining consciousness while his body was battered against submerged rocks. Time became meaningless in the underground river. Seconds or hours. Itachi couldn't determine, existing only as the need to keep breathing, to avoid obstacles the current threw him toward, to maintain enough awareness that drowning remained improbable rather than inevitable. Then air changed. Still toxic, still thick with industrial pollutants, but different from the underhive's stagnant atmosphere. The current accelerated, pulled him through a passage that scraped skin from his shoulders and expelled him into open air, with force that sent him tumbling across ash-covered ground. Itachi lay there, breathing air that his lungs rejected, but his chakra network filtered enough to sustain consciousness. The Sharingan had deactivated at some point during the river passage, chakra reserves too depleted to maintain even basic enhancement. He forced his eyes open through effort that seemed to require more energy than his body possessed. The hive city rose behind him, a mountain of metal and stone that clawed at a sky the color of old blood. He'd traveled kilometers through underground passages, emerged outside the primary structure into the ash wastes that surrounded civilized zones. Pursuit would continue eventually, The Imperium's reach extended beyond single hive cities, but immediate threat had ended. He'd extracted from the dead city alive. Victory felt hollow. Thousands had died in the chaos uprising. Halbrecht's exposure would create consequences, possibly reforms. But the Imperium itself would continue. Another Inquisitor would take his position, implement different policies that achieved similar outcomes through alternative justifications. The machine didn't stop, because Itachi had revealed one component's corruption. But the civilians he'd saved would live. The assassins who'd questioned their orders would remember that questioning was possible. And the populations who'd seen Halbrecht's conspiracy revealed would carry that knowledge forward, a seed that might grow into something larger than individual action could achieve. Itachi pulled himself upright through effort that felt like lifting mountains. His body wanted rest measured in weeks. His chakra reserves needed restoration that required meditation his current situation couldn't accommodate. But he couldn't remain here. Exposure would kill him as efficiently as pursuit forces. He walked into ash wastes, following terrain features that suggested civilization in other directions. Not toward other hive cities, those would be warned of his presence, prepared for his arrival, but toward smaller settlements, places where the Imperium's reach was theoretical rather than absolute. Where someone with skills could trade service for survival until circumstances allowed deeper planning. Behind him, the dead city continued its existence, millions living lives, circumscribed by cruelty they'd been taught to accept as necessary. Most would never know someone had tried to show them alternatives existed. But some would remember, some would question. And questioning was how change began, even in worlds that claimed change was heresy. The crow had left the dead city, but the city was no longer quite as dead as it had been. Truth once spoken couldn't be completely silenced. And mercy once demonstrated proved that alternatives to brutality existed even in the grim darkness of the far future. Itachi walked into ash and wind, his body failing, but not yet failed, his mission complete. But his war continuing. He had survived the impossible again, paid the price again, and would carry the cost of survival forward into whatever future the galaxy forced upon him. Behind him in the depths of the Underhive, the civilians he'd saved, huddled in darkness, and whispered stories of the ghost who'd appeared from nothing to protect them when authority had declared them expendable. The stories would grow change, become myth, disconnected from reality. But at their core would remain truth. Someone had cared when caring meant becoming the thing the Imperium feared most. A person who chose compassion over doctrine, who valued individual lives over institutional necessity, who demonstrated that mercy wasn't weakness, but strength that brutality could never comprehend. The ash wastes consumed him, and Itachi disappeared into distance, carrying wounds that would scar and memories that would haunt, and knowledge that even in the cruelest galaxy, individual choice could create ripples that outlasted individual existence. The dead city stood behind him, and the living world stretched ahead, and between them walked someone who'd proven that the space between power and powerlessness was where humanity actually happened. A tactical genius who could defeat any enemy, but never the loneliness that came with being someone who saw what others chose not to, who acted when others accepted, who refused to surrender compassion, even when compassion meant sacrifice, measured in blood and exhaustion and exile from everything resembling peace. The crow flew away from the dead city, its wings broken but still functional, carrying weight that would never fully heal, but somehow still permitted flight. And in the darkness behind him, in hab blocks and safe zones, and memories that would outlive everyone who'd lived them, the question lingered: if one person could change so much through nothing but skill and refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable, What could many people accomplish if they learned that lesson? The Imperium would classify that question as heresy. But questions once asked couldn't be unasked. And Itachi had asked it in the loudest way possible, not through words but through actions that proved alternatives existed. The ash consumed him completely, and he was gone, a ghost story and a possibility, leaving behind a city that would never quite return to the certainty it had possessed before a crow taught it that compassion was possible even when everything suggested otherwise.